The thunder of cannons at Jena in 1806 did more than determine the fate of Napoleon's campaigns across Europe. As the smoke cleared from that battlefield, a young philosophy professor named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel watched the French emperor ride through the streets and reportedly called him the world soul on horseback. This moment captured something profound about the age that was dawning. The old certainties of the 18th century were crumbling, and philosophers were beginning to see history itself as a dynamic force that shaped not just political events, but the very nature of human consciousness and reality. The period from 1800 to 1900 would witness one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of philosophy. The cool rationalism of the Enlightenment was giving way to something more passionate, more historical, and more concerned with the depths of human experience. This was the age of Romanticism, of German idealism, and eventually of a radical critique of all traditional philosophical assumptions. Thinkers would grapple with questions that seemed almost unthinkable to previous generations. What if reason itself was historically conditioned? What if God was dead? What if philosophy needed to stop interpreting the world and start changing it? Romanticism versus Enlightenment rationalism. The Romantic movement began not in philosophy, but in literature, art and music, emerging from the fertile cultural soil of late 18th century Germany. Where the Enlightenment had emphasized universal reason, clear analysis and scientific method, the Romantics celebrated emotion, imagination, and the unique qualities of individual cultures and personalities. They looked back with nostalgia to the medieval world that the Enlightenment had dismissed as superstitious and dark, finding in it a sense of organic unity and spiritual depth that seemed to be disappearing from the modern world. Johann Gottfried Herder, born in 1744 in East Prussia, was one of the first thinkers to articulate this new sensibility in philosophical terms. Herder had studied with Immanuel Kant in Königsberg, but he came to reject his teacher's emphasis on universal categories of reason that were supposedly the same for all human beings. Instead, Herder developed a philosophy that emphasized the unique spirit or genius of each culture and historical period. Herder's revolutionary insight was that human nature itself was not fixed and universal, but was shaped by language, history, and cultural environment. Each person, he argued, had its own unique way of experiencing and understanding the world, expressed through its language, poetry, mythology, and customs. The German folk was different from the French or English peoples, not just in accidental ways, but in fundamental aspects of their being. This meant that there was no single standard of human excellence or truth that could be applied to all cultures. This idea was radical in its implications. It meant that the Enlightenment project of discovering universal principles of human nature and society was fundamentally misguided. Instead of trying to impose French or English models of civilization on other peoples, we should try to understand each culture from within, appreciating its unique contributions to human experience. Herder's ideas would later influence the development of anthropology, linguistics, and cultural studies, but they also carried more troubling implications that would be exploited by later nationalist and racist ideologies. Herder's philosophy of culture was complemented by new approaches to religion that emphasized feeling and personal experience over rational theology. The most influential of these was developed by Friedrich Schleiermacher, born in 1768 to a family of Reformed Church ministers. Schleiermacher had grown up in the Moravian pietist tradition, which emphasized personal religious experience and emotional connection to God, but he had also been exposed to the skeptical philosophy of the Enlightenment, which seemed to make traditional religious beliefs intellectually untenable. Schleiermacher's solution was to relocate religion entirely outside the sphere of rational knowledge. Religion, he argued, was not a matter of believing certain propositions about God or the world. Instead, it was an immediate feeling of absolute dependence, a direct intuition of the infinite that could not be captured in concepts or arguments. This feeling was universal, present in all human beings regardless of their particular religious traditions or intellectual sophistication. This approach allowed Schleiermacher to defend religion against the attacks of Enlightenment skeptics, while also acknowledging the validity of rational criticism. Science and philosophy dealt with the finite world of objects and their relationships, while religion opened up awareness of the infinite ground of all existence. There could be no conflict between them because they operated in completely different spheres of human experience. Schleiermacher's influence on 19th-century theology was enormous, but his approach also reflected a broader Romantic emphasis on feeling, intuition, and immediate experience as sources of truth that were more fundamental than abstract reasoning. The Romantics did not reject reason entirely, but they insisted that it needed to be balanced by other ways of knowing that had been neglected by the Enlightenment. This Romantic sensibility also transformed how people thought about art and aesthetics. Where earlier philosophers had seen art as primarily a matter of following rules and creating beautiful objects, the Romantics saw artistic creation as a form of revelation that could disclose truths about reality that were inaccessible to ordinary experience. The poet or artist became a kind of secular prophet, able to see into the heart of things and express insights that could not be communicated through rational discourse. Into this ferment of Romantic ideas stepped Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who would create the most ambitious and comprehensive philosophical system since Aristotle. Born in 1770 in Stuttgart to a middle-class family, Hegel initially studied theology at the University of Tübingen, where he formed lifelong friendships with the poet Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. But Hegel's interests soon turned from theology to philosophy, and he began developing ideas that would revolutionize how people thought about reality, history, and human consciousness. Hegel's great insight was that reality itself was fundamentally historical and dialectical. Unlike earlier philosophers who had looked for eternal truths that transcended the flux of historical change, Hegel argued that truth itself developed through time. Reality was not a collection of static objects, but a dynamic process of becoming, driven by internal contradictions that generated new forms of being and consciousness. This process followed what Hegel called the dialectical method, though he himself never used the simple formula of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that later interpreters would associate with his name. Instead, Hegel saw dialectical development as a complex process in which any finite reality contained within itself the seeds of its own negation, leading to a higher form that preserved what was valuable in the original while transcending its limitations. For example, consider the concept of being, which seems to be the most basic and universal concept we can think of. But when we try to think of pure being, stripped of all particular characteristics, we discover that it is identical to nothing, since pure being without any qualities is indistinguishable from non-being. This contradiction leads to a higher concept, becoming, which unifies being and nothing by showing how they are moments in a dynamic process of coming to be and passing away. Hegel applied this dialectical method to every aspect of reality, from the most abstract logical concepts to the most concrete historical developments. His first major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807, traced the development of consciousness from its most primitive forms to absolute knowledge, showing how each stage of consciousness contained contradictions that drove it to higher levels of understanding. One of the most famous sections of the Phenomenology was Hegel's analysis of the master-slave dialectic, which showed how self-consciousness could only emerge through recognition by another consciousness. Two self-consciousnesses encounter each other, and each demands recognition from the other. Since neither can achieve recognition without risking their life, they engage in a life-and-death struggle. One eventually submits to preserve their life, becoming the slave, while the other achieves recognition as the master. But this relationship turns out to be unstable and self-defeating. The master achieves recognition only from someone he does not recognize as an equal, so his recognition is empty and unsatisfying. The slave, meanwhile, develops skills and self-knowledge through labor that eventually makes him more truly free than his master. This dialectical reversal shows how relationships of domination contain the seeds of their own transformation. Hegel used this analysis to illuminate everything from personal relationships to historical developments. The institution of slavery, for example, was not just an unfortunate accident, but a necessary stage in the historical development of human freedom. Through the experience of slavery and the struggles against it, human beings came to understand more fully what freedom meant and why it was valuable. This brings us to one of Hegel's most controversial ideas, his philosophy of history. Hegel argued that history was not just a random sequence of events, but the progressive development of human freedom and self-consciousness. World history was the story of spirit, the underlying rational structure of reality, coming to know itself through human consciousness and institutions. This development was not smooth or automatic, but proceeded through conflict, suffering, and apparent irrationality. Great historical figures like Napoleon were world historical individuals who served as unconscious agents of spirit, bringing about necessary changes even when their conscious intentions were quite different. The French Revolution, despite its violence and chaos, was a necessary stage in the development of human freedom, establishing principles that would eventually be realized more fully in subsequent historical periods. Hegel's famous metaphor of the Owl of Minerva captured his view of the relationship between philosophy and history. Philosophy, like the owl that flies at dusk, could only understand historical developments after they had occurred. The philosopher could not predict the future or prescribe what ought to happen, but could only make sense of what had already unfolded by showing its rational necessity. This historical approach to philosophy had profound implications. It meant that all philosophical systems, including Hegel's own, were historically conditioned and would eventually be superseded by new developments. But it also meant that each historical period had its own validity and could not be judged by the standards of later times. The Greeks and Romans, medieval Christians and modern Europeans each represented necessary stages in the development of human consciousness. Hegel's influence on subsequent philosophy was overwhelming, but it took two very different directions. Some followers, known as the young Hegelians, emphasized the critical and revolutionary implications of his philosophy, arguing that the dialectical method could be used to critique existing institutions and point toward future transformations. Others, the old Hegelians, emphasized the conservative implications, arguing that Hegel had shown the rational necessity of existing social and political arrangements, While Hegel was developing his optimistic vision of history as the progressive development of reason and freedom, another German philosopher was reaching very different conclusions about the nature of reality and human existence. Arthur Schopenhauer, born in 1788 to a wealthy merchant family in Danzig, created a philosophical system that was profoundly pessimistic, arguing that existence was essentially suffering and that the best we could hope for was temporary escape from the torments of life. Schopenhauer's philosophy began with a radical reinterpretation of Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. Kant had argued that we could never know things as they are in themselves, but only as they appear to us through the forms of space, time, and causality. Schopenhauer agreed that the world of everyday experience was merely phenomenal, but he claimed to have discovered what lay behind the appearances. The world as we ordinarily experience it, what Schopenhauer called the world as representation, was indeed a realm of illusion, what the Hindu tradition called Maya. This world of separate objects existing in space and time and connected by causal relationships was not ultimately real, but was a kind of dream or projection. But unlike Kant, Schopenhauer claimed that we could penetrate behind this veil of illusion to discover the true nature of reality. The key to this discovery was the recognition that we ourselves are not just knowing subjects, but also willing beings. We experience our own bodies not just as objects in space, but as the immediate expression of our will, our desires and drives. This will is not rational or purposeful, but is a blind, irrational force that drives us to seek satisfaction without any ultimate goal or purpose. Schopenhauer's crucial insight was that this will that we experience in ourselves is the same force that underlies all of reality. The world as it truly is, the thing in itself that Kant had declared unknowable, is will. All the apparent diversity of the phenomenal world, all the separate objects and individuals, are really manifestations of this one cosmic will. This led Schopenhauer to a radically pessimistic conclusion about the nature of existence. Since all beings are expressions of the same blind will, all life is essentially striving, wanting, needing. But satisfaction is always temporary, and new desires immediately arise to take the place of those that have been fulfilled. Life oscillates between the pain of wanting and the boredom of temporary satisfaction, with no possibility of lasting happiness or fulfillment. The implications of this view were devastating. Love, which seemed to be one of the most beautiful and meaningful aspects of human existence, was revealed as the will to life tricking individuals into reproducing and perpetuating the cycle of suffering. Sexual desire was not romantic communion, but the species using individuals for its own blind purposes. Even intellectual and artistic achievements were ultimately forms of self-deception, ways of avoiding confrontation with the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. But Schopenhauer did not leave us entirely without hope. He identified two possible forms of temporary escape from the tyranny of the will. The first was aesthetic experience, particularly the contemplation of great art and music. In genuine aesthetic experience, we momentarily forget our individual will and become pure subjects of knowing, absorbed in the contemplation of timeless ideas or forms. Music was especially powerful because it was not a representation of the world of appearances, but a direct expression of the will itself. The second form of escape was moral, achieved through compassion and the recognition of the illusory nature of individual separateness. When we truly understand that all beings are manifestations of the same will, we can no longer be indifferent to the suffering of others. This recognition can lead to a kind of resignation or renunciation of the will to live, a turning away from the endless cycle of desire and satisfaction. Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Indian philosophy, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, which he encountered through Latin translations of Sanskrit texts. He saw his own philosophy as a rational demonstration of insights that had been expressed mythologically in Eastern religions. The Buddhist doctrine of suffering, the Hindu concept of Maya or illusion, and the ideal of renunciation and escape from the cycle of rebirth all found philosophical expression in Schopenhauer's system. This made Schopenhauer one of the first Western philosophers to take non-Western philosophical traditions seriously as sources of philosophical insight rather than mere curiosities. His influence would extend far beyond academic philosophy to literature, music and psychology. Writers like Thomas Mann and Marcel Proust, composers like Richard Wagner, and psychologists like Sigmund Freud all acknowledged their debt to Schopenhauer's insights into the irrational foundations of human existence. Schopenhauer's relationship with Hegel was one of bitter antagonism. He saw Hegel's optimistic rationalism as a fundamental betrayal of philosophical honesty, a refusal to confront the harsh realities of existence. Where Hegel saw history as the progressive development of reason and freedom, Schopenhauer saw only the endless repetition of the same basic patterns of striving and suffering. Where Hegel found meaning and purpose in historical development, Schopenhauer found only the blind operation of an irrational will. This disagreement between Hegel and Schopenhauer would echo through subsequent German philosophy, with some thinkers following Hegel's emphasis on historical development and rational progress, while others were drawn to Schopenhauer's darker vision of existence as fundamentally irrational and tragic. While German philosophers were constructing grand systematic theories about the nature of reality and history, a young Danish writer was developing a very different approach to philosophical questions. Søren Kierkegaard, born in Copenhagen in 1813, would become known as the father of existentialism, though he would have rejected this label along with most other systematic philosophical categories. Kierkegaard's life was marked by a profound sense of melancholy and anxiety that he traced back to his relationship with his father. Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard was a successful wool merchant who had experienced a religious conversion that filled him with a sense of guilt and foreboding. He believed that he and his family were cursed by God, and he communicated this sense of doom to his sensitive son, who would spend his life wrestling with questions of sin, guilt, and redemption. The younger Kierkegaard was brilliant and well-educated, but he was also deeply troubled by what he saw as the complacency and superficiality of Danish society and the Danish Lutheran Church. He was particularly opposed to the kind of systematic philosophy that Hegel represented, arguing that such systems missed what was most important about human existence, the concrete situation of the individual who must make choices without certainty about their consequences. Kierkegaard's critique of systematic philosophy was not merely intellectual, but deeply personal. He had experienced what he called the sickness unto death, a form of despair that he saw as the fundamental condition of human existence. This despair was not simply sadness or depression, but a more profound spiritual condition, a kind of self-contradiction in which the self was unable to accept itself or its situation. According to Kierkegaard, human beings exist in a state of constant tension between different aspects of their nature. We are finite beings who nonetheless have intimations of the infinite. We are temporal creatures who can conceive of eternity. We are determined by our circumstances and our nature, Yet we experience ourselves as free and responsible for our choices. This tension creates what Kierkegaard called anxiety or dread, a fundamental mood that reveals our freedom and responsibility. Kierkegaard identified three basic stages or spheres of existence through which individuals might pass in their development. The aesthetic stage was characterized by the pursuit of immediate pleasure and the avoidance of commitment. The aesthetic individual lived for the moment, seeking variety and stimulation, but avoiding the deeper questions of meaning and value. This lifestyle ultimately led to boredom and despair, as no finite pleasure could provide lasting satisfaction. The ethical stage involved commitment to universal moral principles and social roles. The ethical individual took responsibility for their actions and tried to live according to duty and moral law. This was a higher form of existence than the aesthetic, but it too had its limitations. The ethical individual could become trapped in legalism and self-righteousness, and there were situations where universal moral principles conflicted with deeper spiritual truths. The highest stage was the religious, which involved a leap of faith beyond rational and moral categories. The religious individual recognized that ultimate truth could not be reached through reason or morality alone, but required a passionate, personal commitment that transcended objective certainty. This leap of faith was not irrational but transrational, involving the whole person in a way that mere intellectual assent could not. Kierkegaard's analysis of the story of Abraham and Isaac became one of his most powerful illustrations of the religious stage. When God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham was faced with a situation where religious obedience conflicted with ethical duty. From the ethical standpoint, Abraham was simply a potential murderer who planned to kill his innocent son. But from the religious standpoint, Abraham was a knight of faith who trusted in God despite the apparent contradiction. This story showed that the religious dimension of existence could not be reduced to ethical or rational categories. The religious individual might be called to act in ways that appeared immoral or irrational to others, but which were nevertheless authentic expressions of their relationship to the Absolute. This did not mean that religion was simply subjective or arbitrary, but rather that it involved a kind of truth that could not be captured in objective, universal terms. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the individual against the crowd was central to his philosophy. He saw his age as one of increasing conformity and levelling, where genuine individuality was being lost in the mass. The crowd, whether in the form of public opinion, social convention, or systematic philosophy, was always wrong because it obscured the unique situation and responsibility of the individual. This led Kierkegaard to develop what he called indirect communication as his preferred method of philosophical writing. Instead of presenting systematic arguments or clear doctrines, he wrote under various pseudonyms, each representing a different perspective or stage of existence. His readers were forced to engage actively with his texts, making their own decisions about which viewpoints to accept or reject. This method was designed to foster authentic individual choice rather than passive acceptance of authority. Kierkegaard's influence on subsequent philosophy would be enormous, though it would take decades for his ideas to be fully appreciated. His emphasis on existence over essence, on individual choice over systematic reason, and on the limits of objective knowledge would inspire the existentialist movement of the 20th century. But his influence extended beyond philosophy to theology, psychology, and literature as thinkers recognized the depth of his insights into the human condition. While Kierkegaard was exploring the depths of individual existence, Another young philosopher was developing ideas that would have an even more dramatic impact on the course of world history. Karl Marx, born in 1818 in the Prussian Rhineland to a middle-class Jewish family that had converted to Christianity, would create a philosophical system that aimed not just to understand the world, but to transform it. Marx's intellectual development was shaped by his encounter with Hegel's philosophy during his student years in Berlin. He was initially attracted to the young Hegelian movement, which emphasized the critical and revolutionary implications of Hegel's dialectical method. But Marx soon became convinced that Hegel's idealism was fundamentally flawed, standing reality on its head by treating ideas and consciousness as the primary forces in history. Marx's crucial insight was that Hegel's dialectical method was basically correct, but that it needed to be turned right side up. Instead of seeing history as the development of spirit or idea, Marx argued that it should be understood as the development of material conditions, particularly the modes of production by which human beings create their means of subsistence. This approach, which Marx called historical materialism, made economic relationships rather than ideas the fundamental driving force of historical change. According to Marx, human beings distinguish themselves from animals not by their capacity for reason or language, but by their ability to produce their means of subsistence. This productive activity was not just a means of survival, but the fundamental human activity through which people created themselves and their world. The way that production was organized in any given society, what Marx called the mode of production, determined the basic structure of that society's institutions, ideas, and culture. This led Marx to his famous formulation that the economic base of society determines its ideological superstructure. The legal, political, religious, and philosophical ideas of any society were not independent developments, but reflected the interests and relationships of the dominant economic class. What appeared to be eternal truths or natural laws were actually historical products that served to justify existing economic arrangements. Marx applied this analysis to the development of capitalism, which he saw as a historically progressive but ultimately self-destructive system. Capitalism had emerged from feudalism through a process of primitive accumulation that separated workers from their means of production, creating a class of propertyless labourers who had to sell their labour power to survive. This system was more productive than any previous economic arrangement, but it was also fundamentally exploitative and alienating. The concept of alienation was central to Marx's critique of capitalism. Under capitalist production, workers became alienated from the products of their labour, which belonged to the capitalist rather than to those who created them. They became alienated from the process of production, which was controlled by others and organised for profit rather than human fulfilment. They became alienated from their own human essence as creative beings, reduced to mere appendages of machines. And they became alienated from each other, forced to compete for jobs and wages rather than cooperating for common goals. This alienation was not just a subjective experience, but an objective social condition built into the structure of capitalist production. It could not be overcome through individual effort or moral reform, but only through the revolutionary transformation of the economic system itself. This transformation would come about through the internal contradictions of capitalism, which created the conditions for its own overthrow. Marx argued that capitalism was driven by competition between capitalists to increase profits, which led them to invest in labour-saving technology and to drive down wages. But this created a fundamental contradiction. The same process that increased productivity also reduced the purchasing power of workers, leading to periodic crises of overproduction and unemployment. These crises would become more severe over time, eventually leading to the collapse of the system and its replacement by socialism. The agent of this transformation would be the working class or proletariat, which capitalism itself was creating and organizing. As capitalist production became more socialized and concentrated, workers would develop class consciousness and recognize their common interests in opposition to the capitalist class. The revolution would not be simply a political change, but a social transformation that would create a classless society based on common ownership of the means of production. Marx's famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach declared that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This statement captured Marx's conviction that philosophy needed to become practical and critical rather than merely contemplative. True philosophy was not abstract speculation, but the theoretical expression of revolutionary practice. This approach represented a fundamental break with the philosophical tradition that had dominated Western thought since ancient times. Instead of seeking eternal truths or universal principles, Marx developed a form of analysis that was historical, materialist, and oriented towards practical transformation. His work influenced not only subsequent philosophy but also economics, sociology, political science, and revolutionary movements around the world. Marx's relationship to Hegel was complex and dialectical. He acknowledged his debt to Hegel's dialectical method while rejecting his idealism. Where Hegel had seen the dialectical development of ideas, Marx saw the dialectical development of material conditions. Where Hegel had found reconciliation and the end of history in the Prussian state, Marx found only the beginning of truly human history in the communist society that would emerge from the collapse of capitalism. As the 19th century drew to a close, a philosopher emerged who would challenge not just particular philosophical systems, but the entire Western philosophical and religious tradition. Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in the Prussian province of Saxony, was the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Friedrich was only 5 years old. This early experience of loss and the collapse of paternal authority would profoundly shape Nietzsche's later philosophy. Nietzsche was a brilliant student who showed exceptional promise in classical philology, becoming a professor at the University of Basel at the remarkably young age of 24. But his interests soon expanded beyond classical scholarship to encompass philosophy, psychology, and cultural criticism. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, challenged conventional understanding of ancient Greek culture by arguing that Greek tragedy emerged from the tension between two opposing forces: the Apollonian drive toward order, rationality, and beautiful appearances, and the Dionysian drive toward chaos, passion, and the dissolution of individual identity. This early work already contained themes that would dominate Nietzsche's mature philosophy: the critique of rationalism, the affirmation of life in all its tragic dimensions, and the recognition that human existence required creative self-interpretation rather than passive acceptance of given truths. But it was in his later works that Nietzsche would develop his most radical and influential ideas. The centerpiece of Nietzsche's mature philosophy was his proclamation of the death of God. This was not simply a statement of atheism, but a diagnosis of the spiritual condition of modern European civilization. God had not simply been disproven by science or philosophy, rather, belief in God had become psychologically and culturally impossible for honest, thoughtful people. The Christian worldview that had provided meaning and values for Western civilization for over 1,000 years was collapsing, and nothing had yet emerged to take its place. Nietzsche saw this collapse as both a crisis and an opportunity. The death of God meant the end of objective, transcendent sources of meaning and value. There was no divine command, no natural law, no rational principle that could tell human beings how they ought to live. This was terrifying because it meant that human existence was fundamentally groundless and that traditional moral and religious authorities had lost their legitimacy. But it was also liberating because it opened up possibilities for creating new values and new ways of life. The central concept in Nietzsche's response to this situation was what he called the will to power. This was not simply a desire for political domination, but a more fundamental drive that Nietzsche saw as underlying all life and all human activity. The will to power was the drive to expand, to grow, to impose one's interpretation on the world, to create values and meanings rather than simply accepting those that were given. Nietzsche argued that traditional morality, particularly Christian morality, was actually an expression of weakness and resentment rather than strength and nobility. What Christianity called virtues, such as humility, selflessness and pity, were actually ways that the weak and unsuccessful consoled themselves for their failures and tried to make the strong feel guilty for their success. This slave morality had triumphed over the master morality of the ancient aristocrats, but at the cost of making human beings smaller, weaker and more mediocre. The overcoming of this condition would require the emergence of what Nietzsche called the Overman, or Superman, Übermensch. This was not a biological evolution, but a cultural and spiritual transformation. The Overman would be someone who could create their own values without relying on external authorities, who could affirm life even in its tragic and painful aspects, and who could impose their own interpretation on existence rather than accepting inherited meanings. Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence was closely connected to this ideal of self-creation and affirmation. He asked his readers to imagine that they would have to live their lives exactly as they had lived them, over and over again for eternity, with every joy and every suffering repeated infinitely. Could they honestly say yes to such an existence? This was not a metaphysical doctrine about the actual structure of time, but a kind of existential test. Only someone who could affirm their life in this ultimate way had achieved the kind of self-creation and authenticity that Nietzsche associated with the Overman. These ideas led Nietzsche to develop what he called a genealogical method for understanding moral and cultural values. Instead of asking whether particular values were true or false, right or wrong, Nietzsche asked how they had developed historically and what psychological needs they served. His genealogy of morals traced the development of Christian values from their origins in Jewish resentment against Roman power through their transformation into a universal religion that promised rewards for the weak and punishments for the strong. This genealogical approach revealed that what people took to be eternal, objective truths were actually historical products that reflected particular perspectives and interests. There were no facts, only interpretations, and the question was not which interpretation was objectively correct, but which interpretations were life-enhancing and which were life-denying. Nietzsche's philosophy was profoundly unsettling to his contemporaries, and his ideas were often misunderstood and misappropriated. His critique of democracy and equality was seized upon by later fascist movements, though Nietzsche himself was contemptuous of nationalism and anti-Semitism. His proclamation of the death of God was seen as nihilistic, though Nietzsche himself was trying to overcome nihilism by pointing toward new possibilities for meaning and value. The tragedy of Nietzsche's life was that he suffered a mental breakdown in 1889 at the age of 44 and spent his remaining years in a state of insanity until his death in 1900. This collapse came just as he was reaching the height of his creative powers, and it meant that many of his most radical ideas were expressed in fragments and notes rather than fully developed works. The rise of scientific philosophy. While German philosophers were developing increasingly complex and systematic approaches to understanding reality and human existence, other thinkers were beginning to question whether philosophy could or should compete with the rapidly advancing natural sciences. The spectacular success of physics, chemistry, and biology in explaining natural phenomena and developing practical applications raised fundamental questions about the role and methods of philosophy. Auguste Comte, born in France in 1798, was one of the first thinkers to develop a systematic response to this challenge. Comte argued that human thought had evolved through three stages. The theological stage, in which people explain phenomena by reference to supernatural beings, the metaphysical stage, in which they appealed to abstract forces and principles, and finally, the positive or scientific stage, in which they sought to discover empirical laws that described the relationships between observable phenomena. According to Comte, the positive stage represented the highest form of human knowledge because it was based on observation and experimentation rather than speculation and imagination. Philosophy and theology belonged to earlier stages of human development and would eventually be replaced by scientific knowledge. Comte even proposed a hierarchy of the sciences with mathematics at the base, followed by astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, and finally sociology, which he saw as the most complex and important science because it studied human society. This positivist approach had profound implications for how people thought about knowledge and truth. It suggested that the only genuine knowledge was scientific knowledge, and that questions that could not be answered by scientific methods were meaningless pseudo-problems. Metaphysical questions about the ultimate nature of reality, theological questions about the existence and nature of God, and even ethical questions about right and wrong were either meaningless or could be reduced to empirical questions about human behaviour and social organisation. John Stuart Mill, born in London in 1806, developed a more sophisticated version of empiricism that tried to ground both scientific and moral knowledge in experience. Mill was raised according to the strict utilitarian principles of his father, James Mill and Jeremy Bentham, who argued that the rightness or wrongness of actions should be judged solely by their consequences for human happiness or well-being. The younger Mill accepted the basic utilitarian framework, but tried to develop it in more nuanced and humane directions. His system of logic attempted to show how scientific reasoning could be applied to moral and social questions, while his On Liberty argued for the fundamental importance of individual freedom and the limits of social authority over individual choice. Mill's harm principle became one of the most influential ideas in liberal political philosophy. He argued that society should only restrict individual liberty when someone's actions harm others, and that there should be a sphere of purely self-regarding actions in which individuals should be free to make their own choices, even if those choices were foolish or harmful to themselves. This principle was based not on abstract rights, but on utilitarian calculations about what social arrangements would promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Herbert Spencer, born in England in 1820, tried to apply evolutionary thinking to social and moral questions. Spencer was influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, but he extended evolutionary ideas far beyond biology to encompass psychology, sociology, and ethics. He argued that human societies, like biological organisms, evolved from simple to complex forms through a process of natural selection that favoured those institutions and practices that were best adapted to their environment. This led Spencer to develop what came to be known as social Darwinism, the idea that social progress occurred through competition between individuals and groups, with the fittest surviving and reproducing while the unfit were eliminated. Spencer opposed most forms of government intervention in the economy and society, arguing that such interference disrupted the natural processes of social evolution and prevented the emergence of higher forms of social organization. While continental philosophers were grappling with questions of existence and human experience, another philosophical revolution was taking place primarily in Britain and America. This movement, which came to be known as analytic philosophy, approached philosophical problems from a completely different angle. Instead of focusing on lived experience or social criticism, these philosophers believed that most philosophical problems arose from confusion about language and could be solved through careful logical analysis. They saw philosophy not as a quest for wisdom about how to live, but as a technical discipline that could achieve the same kind of precision and progress as mathematics and science. The roots of this analytical approach can be traced back to the late 19th century, but it truly flourished in the first half of the 20th century. These philosophers shared a conviction that traditional philosophical methods had led to centuries of fruitless debate because they had not been sufficiently rigorous. By applying the tools of modern logic and paying careful attention to the structure of language, they believed they could finally put philosophy on a secure scientific foundation. The story of analytic philosophy begins with Gottlob Frege, a German mathematician and philosopher who was born in 1848 in the small town of Wismar. Frege was a quiet, methodical man who spent most of his career as a mathematics professor at the University of Jena. He might have remained a footnote in the history of mathematics if not for his revolutionary insights about the nature of logic and language. Insights that would transform philosophy in ways he never anticipated. Frege's initial goal was purely mathematical. He wanted to show that arithmetic could be reduced to logic, that the basic truths of mathematics were really just complex logical truths. This project, known as logicism, required him to develop a much more sophisticated understanding of logical relationships than had existed before. In pursuing this goal, Frege created the first modern system of mathematical logic, introducing symbols and methods that are still used today. But Frege's most important contribution to philosophy came from his analysis of meaning and reference. He noticed that our ordinary ways of talking about meaning were confused and imprecise. For example, consider the statements, "The morning star is Venus," and "The evening star is Venus." Both statements are true, and both refer to the same planet, but they seem to convey different information. The first might be news to someone who knows about Venus and the morning star, but had not realized they were the same object. To explain this puzzle, Frege distinguished between the sense and reference of linguistic expressions. The reference is simply the object that the expression picks out in the world. Both the morning star and the evening star refer to Venus, But the sense is the mode of presentation, the way the object is given to us in thought. The morning star presents Venus as the bright object visible in the eastern sky before dawn, while the evening star presents it as the bright object visible in the western sky after sunset. This distinction had profound implications for philosophy. It suggested that understanding language required paying attention not just to what words refer to, but to how they present their reference to our minds. It also suggested that many philosophical problems might arise from confusing sense and reference, or from failing to notice when expressions had sense but no reference, like the present King of France, in a world where France is a republic. Frege's work on logic and language caught the attention of a young British philosopher named Bertrand Russell, who would become one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Russell was born in 1872 into one of Britain's most prominent aristocratic families. His grandfather had been Prime Minister, and Russell himself would later become the third Earl Russell. But despite his privileged background, Russell was a restless, questioning mind who was never satisfied with conventional answers. Russell had initially been drawn to philosophy through his study of mathematics at Cambridge University. Like many mathematicians of his time, he was troubled by the lack of secure foundations for mathematical knowledge. Mathematical truths seemed certain and universal, but what exactly made them true? Russell hoped that Frege's Logicist program might provide the answer by showing that mathematics was really just logic in disguise. Russell threw himself into developing this program, working closely with his former teacher Alfred North Whitehead to produce the monumental Principia Mathematica, a 3-volume attempt to derive all of mathematics from logical principles. The work was incredibly technical and detailed, requiring years of painstaking calculation and proof. Russell later joked that he and Whitehead spent the better part of a year proving that 1 + 1 = 2. But Russell's most famous contribution to philosophy came from a paradox he discovered in Frege's logical system. Russell noticed that Frege's system allowed for the existence of sets that contained themselves as members. For example, the set of all sets would presumably contain itself, since it is itself a set. But what about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members? If this set contains itself, then it belongs to the category of sets that do contain themselves, which means it should not contain itself. But if it does not contain itself, then it belongs to the category of sets that do not contain themselves, which means it should contain itself. This paradox, known as Russell's paradox, revealed a fundamental inconsistency in the logical foundations of mathematics. It showed that our intuitive notions of sets and classes, which seemed so clear and obvious, actually led to contradictions when pushed to their logical limits. The discovery sent shock waves through the mathematical community and launched what became known as the foundational crisis in mathematics. Russell's paradox was not just a technical problem for mathematicians. It illustrated a general philosophical point about the importance of logical rigor and precision. Traditional philosophical reasoning, Russell argued, was full of similar hidden contradictions and confusions. The only way to make progress was to apply the same kind of careful logical analysis that had revealed the paradox in the first place. This conviction led Russell to develop a comprehensive philosophical program based on what he called logical atomism. According to this view, the world consists of simple atomic facts that cannot be broken down further. Complex facts are built up from these atomic facts through logical combinations. Similarly, language consists of simple names that refer to simple objects, and complex sentences that mirror the logical structure of complex facts. Russell's theory of descriptions became one of his most influential contributions to this program. He was puzzled by sentences like, "The present King of France is bald," which seemed to be meaningful even though there is no present King of France for the sentence to be about. How can we understand sentences that seem to refer to non-existent objects? Russell's solution was to show that such sentences are actually much more complex than they appear on the surface. "The present King of France is bald" really means something like, there is exactly one thing that is presently King of France, and that thing is bald. When we analyze the sentence this way, we can see that it is false, not because it attributes baldness to a non-existent person, but because its first clause is false. There is not exactly one thing that is presently King of France, so the entire sentence is false. This technique of logical analysis became Russell's preferred method for solving philosophical problems. Instead of engaging in abstract metaphysical speculation, philosophers should carefully analyze the logical structure of the sentences we use to express our thoughts. Many traditional philosophical problems, Russell believed, would simply disappear once we understood the real logical form of the language we use to state them. Russell's approach attracted many followers, but none more influential than Ludwig Wittgenstein, a brilliant young Austrian who arrived at Cambridge in 1911 to study with Russell. Wittgenstein was born in 1889 into one of Vienna's wealthiest families. His father was a steel magnate, and the Wittgenstein family was deeply involved in Vienna's rich cultural life. The family home was a gathering place for artists, musicians and intellectuals, and Ludwig grew up surrounded by discussions of art, music and ideas. Despite this cultured background, Wittgenstein initially studied engineering and was particularly interested in aeronautics. He went to Manchester to work on aircraft design, but his interest in the mathematical problems involved in engineering led him to study the foundations of mathematics. This in turn led him to Russell's work and eventually to Cambridge. Wittgenstein's relationship with Russell was intense and complicated. Russell quickly recognized Wittgenstein's genius, but was often baffled by his unconventional approach to philosophical problems. Wittgenstein would pace around Russell's rooms at all hours, wrestling with deep questions about logic and language. He often seemed more interested in the spiritual and ethical implications of philosophical problems than in their technical solutions. When World War I broke out, Wittgenstein enlisted in the Austrian army and served on the Eastern and Italian fronts. Throughout the war, he carried with him a notebook in which he recorded his philosophical thoughts. These notes would eventually become his first and most famous book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921. The Tractatus was unlike any philosophical work that had come before. It consisted of numbered propositions arranged in a hierarchical structure, starting with the most general claims about the nature of reality and working down to more specific consequences. The book's central insight was what Wittgenstein called the picture theory of language. According to this theory, language works by picturing reality. Just as a photograph represents a scene by having a structure that corresponds to the structure of what it depicts, sentences represent facts by having a logical structure that mirrors the logical structure of what they describe. The cat is on the mat pictures the fact that the cat is on the mat by arranging words in a way that corresponds to the arrangement of objects in reality. This picture theory led Wittgenstein to some striking conclusions about the limits of language and thought. If language works by picturing facts, then we can only speak meaningfully about things that can be pictured. This includes all the facts of natural science, which describe how things are arranged in space and time, but it rules out statements about ethics, aesthetics, religion, and the meaning of life, which do not describe factual arrangements, but rather express our attitudes and values. This limitation led to Tractatus's most famous conclusion: whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The most important questions in life, questions about how we should live, what makes life meaningful, whether God exists, cannot be answered through language because they lie beyond the bounds of what can be pictured. This did not make these questions unimportant. On the contrary, Wittgenstein thought they were the most important questions of all. But philosophy, understood as the logical analysis of language, could not help us answer them. Having solved what he took to be all the problems of philosophy, Wittgenstein left academic life and spent the 1920s working as an elementary school teacher in rural Austria, designing a house for his sister and contemplating entering a monastery. He believed that the Tractatus had shown the limits of what could be said, and that anything truly important lay beyond those limits in the realm of what could only be shown or lived. Logical positivism, science as the model. While Wittgenstein was wrestling with the limits of language, a group of philosophers and scientists in Vienna were developing a more optimistic view of what philosophical analysis could accomplish. This group, known as the Vienna Circle, shared Russell's conviction that philosophical problems could be solved through logical analysis, but they were particularly impressed by the spectacular successes of modern science and wanted to use scientific methods as a model for all human knowledge. The Vienna Circle emerged in the 1920s around the figure of Moritz Schlick, a German physicist and philosopher who had been appointed to the chair of philosophy at the University of Vienna in 1922. Schlick had been trained in physics under Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, but he had become interested in the philosophical implications of the new developments in physics. He gathered around him a diverse group of mathematicians, scientists, and philosophers who met regularly to discuss questions about the nature of knowledge and scientific method. The circle included some of the most brilliant minds of the time. Rudolf Carnap was a logician and philosopher who would become one of the most influential figures in 20th century philosophy. Otto Neurath was a sociologist and economist interested in the social applications of scientific knowledge. Herbert Feigl was a philosopher concerned with the relationship between physics and psychology. Kurt Gödel, though not a regular participant, was associated with the circle and would later prove fundamental theorems about the limits of mathematical systems. The Vienna Circle philosophers called themselves logical positivists, linking themselves to the 19th century positivist tradition that had emphasized the importance of empirical observation, while adding the new tools of mathematical logic that had been developed by Frege, Russell, and others. They believed that all genuine knowledge must be based on experience and must be expressible in the precise language of logic and mathematics. The centerpiece of logical positivist philosophy was the verification principle, which stated that the meaning of a statement is identical to the method of its verification. A statement is meaningful if and only if there is some possible experience that would confirm or disconfirm it. Statements that cannot be verified or falsified by any possible experience are literally meaningless, not false but empty of cognitive content. This principle had radical implications for traditional philosophy. Most metaphysical claims, such as reality is fundamentally spiritual or everything happens according to God's will, could not be verified by any possible experience. They were therefore meaningless pseudo-statements that should be eliminated from serious discourse. The same was true for ethical statements like murder is wrong, or aesthetic judgments like this painting is beautiful. Since there is no empirical test for rightness or beauty, such statements express emotions or attitudes but convey no factual information. The logical positivists believed that once meaningless statements were eliminated, all genuine knowledge could be unified within a single scientific framework. Physics would provide the fundamental laws governing all natural phenomena. Chemistry would be reduced to physics, biology to chemistry, psychology to biology, and so on. This unity of science program envisioned a time when all human knowledge would be expressed in the precise, mathematical language of theoretical physics. Rudolf Carnap became the most systematic developer of this program. Born in 1891 in Germany, Carnap had studied mathematics, physics and philosophy before joining the Vienna Circle. He was particularly interested in developing a logical reconstruction of scientific concepts that would show exactly how theoretical terms relate to observable phenomena. Carnap's early work focused on what he called the logical construction of the world. He attempted to show how all the concepts we use to describe reality could be defined in terms of immediate sensory experiences and logical operations. Complex concepts like table or electron would be analyzed as logical constructions from simpler concepts referring to patterns of sensory data. This project proved incredibly difficult to carry out in detail. How exactly do you define table in terms of sensory experiences? A table can look different from various angles, feel different depending on the material it is made from, and behave differently in different circumstances. Carnap spent years trying to work out these definitions, but he gradually came to realize that the project might be impossible to complete. Otto Neurath, meanwhile, was developing what he called the protocol sentence theory. According to this view, the foundation of all knowledge consists of protocol sentences that record basic observational experiences. These might be sentences like, red patch now in the center of the visual field, or pointer reading 7.3 on scale. All other scientific statements must be translatable into statements about protocol sentences, or they must be rejected as meaningless. But Neurath's approach led to what became known as the protocol sentence debate, one of the most important discussions within logical positivism. The problem was that protocol sentences, despite being supposedly basic, still involved interpretation and could be mistaken. If I report seeing a red patch, I might be mistaken about the color, or I might be hallucinating. How can we distinguish genuine protocol sentences from false ones? Carnap initially thought that protocol sentences should be about immediate private experiences that could not be doubted. But Neurath argued that this led to an unacceptable subjectivism. If knowledge is based on private experiences, then it becomes impossible to achieve the public objective knowledge that science requires. Neurath proposed instead that protocol sentences should be public statements that can be checked and corrected by the scientific community. This debate revealed deep problems with the logical positivist program. The attempt to find absolutely certain foundations for knowledge was running into the same problems that had plagued earlier empiricists like Hume. Every statement, no matter how basic, involves concepts and assumptions that go beyond immediate experience. Despite these internal difficulties, logical positivism gained wide influence, particularly after many of its proponents fled Nazi Germany and settled in the United States. The movement's influence was enhanced by the publication in 1936 of Language, Truth and Logic by the young British philosopher A.J. Ayer. Alfred Jewell Ayer was born in London in 1910 and studied at Oxford before spending a year in Vienna with the Circle. His book was a brilliant popularization of logical positivist ideas, written in clear, accessible English rather than the technical German that characterized much of the Circle's work. Ayer presented the verification principle as a sword that could cut through centuries of meaningless metaphysical speculation. Ayer's presentation was more radical and uncompromising than that of most Vienna Circle members. He argued that ethical statements are nothing more than expressions of emotion, equivalent to saying hurrah or boo when confronted with actions we approve or disapprove of. Religious statements are simply meaningless because they refer to a supposed transcendent reality that cannot be empirically verified. Even statements about other minds are problematic because we can never directly observe another person's mental states. Language, truth and logic became enormously influential, particularly in the English-speaking world. It shaped how several generations of philosophers understood the nature and limits of meaningful discourse. But it also provoked strong reactions from philosophers who thought that Ayer's approach was too restrictive and eliminated too much of what makes human life meaningful. Ordinary language philosophy. By the 1940s and 1950s, serious problems were emerging with the logical positivist program. The verification principle itself seemed to be unverifiable. What possible experience could confirm or disconfirm the claim that meaningful statements must be empirically testable? The Unity of Science program was making little progress, and the attempt to reduce all knowledge to physics seemed increasingly implausible. Most importantly, the careful logical analysis that was supposed to solve philosophical problems seemed to be creating new puzzles rather than resolving old ones. These difficulties led to a new movement within analytic philosophy, one that turned away from formal logic and mathematical precision toward a careful study of how language actually works in ordinary contexts. The leaders of this movement argued that traditional philosophical problems arose not from the inherent difficulty of reality, but from misunderstanding how we normally use words and concepts. The most important figure in this transition was Ludwig Wittgenstein himself, who returned to Cambridge in the 1930s with a completely different approach to philosophical problems. Wittgenstein rejected almost everything he had argued in the Tractatus. He no longer believed that language works by picturing reality, nor that there is a single logical structure underlying all meaningful discourse. Instead, Wittgenstein developed what he called the language game approach to understanding meaning. Just as games like chess, football and card games follow different rules and serve different purposes, language games involve different rules and serve different functions. The language game of giving orders works differently from the language game of making jokes, which works differently from the language game of praying, or the language game of doing mathematics. The meaning of words and sentences, according to the later Wittgenstein, comes not from their relationship to reality, but from their use within particular language games. To understand what someone means when they say, "I know," we need to look at how the word know functions in the specific context where it is used. In some contexts, I know expresses confidence. In others, it claims authority. In still others, it acknowledges responsibility. There is no single essence of knowledge that all these uses share. This approach led Wittgenstein to a new understanding of philosophical problems. Traditional philosophical questions like what is knowledge or what is the nature of mind arise from the mistaken assumption that words like knowledge and mind must refer to single unified phenomena. But these words are actually used in many different ways in many different contexts. Philosophical problems dissolve when we pay attention to these different uses instead of looking for impossible unified theories. Wittgenstein worked out these ideas in lectures and conversations with students and colleagues, but he published very little during his lifetime. His influence spread through his students and others who attended his lectures. The most systematic presentation of his later philosophy appeared only after his death in the Philosophical Investigations, published in 1953. John Langshaw Austin, a British philosopher at Oxford, developed similar ideas about the importance of studying ordinary language. Austin was born in 1911 and served as an intelligence officer during World War II before returning to Oxford to teach philosophy. He was known for his wit, his attention to detail, and his ability to find philosophical significance in the most mundane features of everyday speech. Austin's most famous contribution was his theory of speech acts. He noticed that many utterances do not simply describe reality, but actually perform actions. When a judge says, "I sentence you to 5 years in prison," she is not describing a sentence that exists independently of her words. The sentencing consists in the saying of those words under the appropriate circumstances. Similarly, when someone says, "I promise to meet you tomorrow," or "I apologize for my behavior," they are not reporting on promises or apologies, but actually making promises and apologies. Austin called these performative utterances, distinguishing them from constative utterances that simply state facts. This distinction challenged the assumption, common among logical positivists, that the primary function of language is to represent reality. Much of our language use is devoted to doing things with words rather than describing things with words. Austin's analysis of performatives revealed the complex conditions that must be satisfied for speech acts to be successful. For a promise to count as a genuine promise, the speaker must intend to do what they promise, they must believe they are able to do it, they must be addressing someone who wants them to do it, and so on. When these conditions are not met, the speech act is not false, but rather what Austin called infelicitous. It misfires or fails to accomplish what it attempts to do. This attention to the conditions of successful communication led Austin and other ordinary language philosophers to develop increasingly sophisticated accounts of how context affects meaning. The same words can mean very different things depending on who speaks them, when they are spoken, to whom they are addressed, and for what purpose. Gilbert Ryle, another Oxford philosopher, applied this attention to ordinary language to one of the most persistent problems in philosophy, the relationship between mind and body. Ryle was born in 1900 and spent most of his career at Oxford, where he became one of the most influential teachers of his generation. In his book The Concept of Mind, published in 1949, Ryle argued that the traditional mind-body problem rests on what he called a category mistake. When we talk about minds and bodies as if they were two different kinds of things, we are like someone who visits a university, sees the buildings, meets the students and professors, observes the classes and laboratories, and then asks, "But where is the university?" The mistake is to think that the university is some additional entity over and above all the activities and institutions that make it up. Similarly, Ryle argued, the mind is not some ghostly substance that inhabits the physical body. Mental terms like belief, desire, intention, and understanding do not refer to private inner episodes, but rather to patterns of behavior and behavioral dispositions. To say that someone believes it will rain is not to describe some inner mental state, but to say that they are disposed to carry an umbrella, check the weather forecast, cancel outdoor plans, and so on. This behaviourist approach to mental concepts was controversial, but Ryle's more general point about category mistakes became widely influential. Many philosophical problems, he suggested, arise from treating concepts that belong to different logical categories as if they belong to the same category. The solution is not to develop new theories, but to map the logical geography of our concepts more carefully. The ordinary language philosophers shared a therapeutic conception of philosophy. They saw philosophical problems not as deep mysteries about the nature of reality, but as conceptual confusions that could be dissolved through careful attention to how we actually use language. Philosophy's job was not to discover new facts about the world, but to cure us of the intellectual cramps that arise from misusing our own concepts. American pragmatism. While British philosophers were developing these new approaches to language and meaning, American philosophers had been pioneering their own distinctive approach to philosophical problems. This movement, known as pragmatism, emerged in the late 19th century and reached its mature form in the early 20th century. Pragmatists shared the analytic philosophers' dissatisfaction with traditional metaphysical speculation, but they approached philosophical problems from the perspective of practical consequences rather than logical analysis. The founder of pragmatism was Charles Sanders Peirce, a brilliant but eccentric thinker who was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1839. Peirce came from an intellectual family. His father was a Harvard mathematician, and he received training in mathematics, science, and philosophy. He worked for many years as a scientist for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, making important contributions to astronomy, physics, and mathematics while developing his philosophical ideas in his spare time. Peirce's central insight was that the meaning of concepts should be understood in terms of their practical consequences. If two supposedly different ideas have identical practical implications, then they are really the same idea described in different words. If an idea has no practical consequences whatsoever, then it is meaningless. This pragmatic maxim, as Peirce called it, provided a way of cutting through abstract metaphysical debates by focusing on what difference our concepts actually make in practice. For example, consider the question of whether objects have properties when they are not being observed. Traditional philosophy might debate whether a tree falling in an empty forest makes a sound, but Peirce would ask what practical difference it makes whether we say it does or does not make a sound. If there are no practical consequences that flow from answering this question one way rather than another, then the question itself is meaningless. Peirce applied this approach to some of the deepest questions in philosophy. What does it mean to say that something is true? According to Peirce, a true belief is one that would be accepted by anyone who investigated the matter long enough and carefully enough. Truth is not correspondence to some transcendent reality, but rather the ideal end point of scientific inquiry. What does it mean to say that something is real? Real objects are those that would affect our experience regardless of what we might think about them. This approach led Peirce to a distinctive theory of signs and meaning. He argued that all thought involves signs, and that signs acquire their meaning through their relationships to other signs and to the practical activities of the people who use them. This semiotic theory influenced later developments in linguistics, anthropology, and communication theory. Despite the originality and depth of his ideas, Peirce remained largely unknown during his lifetime. His writings were scattered across numerous journals and manuscripts, many of which were not published until decades after his death. His influence on pragmatism came primarily through his friend and colleague William James, who popularized and developed Peirce's ideas in ways that Peirce himself sometimes found distasteful. William James was born in 1842 into one of America's most distinguished intellectual families. His father was a theologian and philosopher. His brother Henry would become one of America's greatest novelists, and William himself would make fundamental contributions to both psychology and philosophy. James studied medicine at Harvard, but was drawn to psychology and philosophy, eventually becoming one of the most influential thinkers of his generation. James was attracted to Peirce's pragmatic approach, but he developed it in a more psychological and individualistic direction. While Peirce had focused on the logical structure of inquiry and meaning, James was interested in the personal and emotional dimensions of belief and experience. He wanted to understand how beliefs function in the actual lives of individuals, not just how they operate in scientific investigation. This led James to his famous essay, The Will to Believe, published in 1896. James argued that in certain circumstances, we have the right to choose our beliefs based on their practical consequences rather than waiting for conclusive evidence. When we face what he called forced, living and momentous options, choices that we cannot avoid making that appeal to real possibilities for us and that have significant consequences for our lives, we may legitimately choose the belief that produces the better practical results. James applied this principle particularly to religious belief. He argued that the existence of God is not something that can be proven or disproven through purely intellectual means. But if believing in God makes someone's life more meaningful, hopeful, and morally motivated, then they have the right to choose that belief. The pragmatic test of religious ideas is not whether they correspond to metaphysical reality, but whether they work in practice to make life better. This pragmatic approach to truth became one of James's most controversial contributions to philosophy. He argued that true ideas are those that work successfully in practice. An idea is true if acting on it leads to satisfactory experiences, if it helps us navigate our environment effectively, if it connects harmoniously with our other beliefs and experiences. Truth is not a static property that ideas possess independently of human activity, but something that happens to ideas in the course of successful experience. Critics attack this view as relativistic, suggesting that it made truth dependent on individual preferences or cultural conventions. James responded that pragmatic truth is not subjective or arbitrary because our environment imposes real constraints on which ideas will work successfully. Ideas that do not fit with the structure of reality will lead to frustration and failure, while ideas that do fit will prove their worth through successful application. James also developed what he called radical empiricism, an attempt to take experience more seriously than traditional empiricism had done. Classical empiricists like Locke and Hume had focused on discrete sensations and ideas, but James argued that experience comes to us as a flowing, connected stream. The connections and relationships between things are as much a part of experience as the things themselves. This insight led James to a distinctive metaphysical position. Instead of assuming that reality consists of separate substances that somehow interact with each other, James suggested that reality consists of pure experience that gets organized into subjects and objects, minds and matter, depending on the context and purpose of inquiry. This neutral monism, as it came to be called, influenced later philosophers and psychologists interested in understanding consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. The third great pragmatist was John Dewey, who was born in Vermont in 1859 and lived until 1952, making him a bridge between 19th and 20th century American thought. Dewey studied philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, where he was influenced by Hegelian idealism, but he gradually moved toward a more naturalistic and pragmatic approach to philosophical problems. Dewey's version of pragmatism was more social and political than that of either Peirce or James. He was deeply concerned with the problems of modern industrial society, and believed that philosophy should contribute to solving these problems rather than retreating into academic abstraction. He saw thinking itself as a form of problem-solving activity that evolved to help organisms adapt to their environments. According to Dewey, all thinking begins with some practical problem or difficulty. We think when our habitual ways of acting are blocked, or when we encounter situations that our past experience has not prepared us to handle. The function of thought is to reconstruct the problematic situation in a way that allows effective action to proceed. Ideas are tools for action, not copies of reality. This instrumentalist approach led Dewey to a distinctive theory of knowledge and truth. Knowledge is not a matter of passive contemplation, but of active inquiry guided by practical purposes. Truth is not correspondence to fixed reality, but the successful resolution of problematic situations through intelligent action. Scientific method is valuable not because it reveals the ultimate nature of reality, but because it provides reliable procedures for solving problems and controlling experience. Dewey applied these ideas most systematically to education and democracy. In education, he argued against the traditional approach that treated students as passive recipients of information transmitted by teachers. Instead, he advocated for progressive education that engaged students in active problem-solving activities connected to their own interests and experiences. Learning should be learning by doing, not just learning by listening. In politics, Dewey argued for what he called democratic experimentalism. Democracy is valuable not just because it respects individual rights, but because it provides the best method for collective problem-solving. Democratic institutions allow different perspectives and interests to be expressed, enable public discussion of alternative solutions, and provide mechanisms for testing policies and revising them based on their consequences. Dewey's influence extended far beyond academic philosophy. His ideas about education transformed American schools and influenced educational theory around the world. His political philosophy contributed to progressive-era reforms and New Deal policies. His approach to social problems influenced sociology, anthropology, and public policy. The pragmatist tradition represented a distinctively American contribution to world philosophy. While European philosophers were often concerned with abstract theoretical questions, American pragmatists focused on the practical consequences of ideas and their effectiveness in solving real human problems. This practical orientation reflected American cultural values, but also offered genuine philosophical insights about the nature of knowledge, truth, and meaning. The analytic revolution of the early 20th century thus took several different forms. Logical atomists like Russell sought to ground philosophy in mathematical logic and scientific method. Logical positivists tried to eliminate meaningless metaphysical speculation by applying rigorous standards of empirical verification. Ordinary language philosophers turned to careful analysis of everyday speech to dissolve traditional philosophical problems. American pragmatists judged ideas by their practical consequences rather than their theoretical coherence. Despite their differences, all these movements shared certain assumptions that distinguished them from earlier philosophical traditions. They were suspicious of grand metaphysical systems and preferred piecemeal analysis of specific problems. They believed that careful attention to language and logic could solve or dissolve many traditional philosophical difficulties. They saw philosophy as a technical discipline that could make progress through rigorous methods rather than as a source of wisdom about how to live. These approaches transformed philosophy in the English-speaking world and continue to influence philosophical discussion today. They established new standards of rigor and precision, developed powerful tools for analyzing language and logic, and showed how philosophical problems might be approached through careful attention to the details of human practice and experience. At the same time, they raised new questions about the scope and limits of philosophical inquiry and about the relationship between philosophical analysis and other forms of human understanding. Chapter 12. Continental Philosophy's Different Path, 1900 to 1950. The turn of the 20th century brought with it a profound crisis that would shake the very foundations of Western thought. The comfortable certainties of the 19th century were crumbling under the weight of devastating world wars, economic collapse, and revolutionary discoveries in science that challenged basic assumptions about reality itself. Einstein's theory of relativity had shown that even space and time were not absolute, while quantum mechanics revealed that the microscopic world behaved in ways that defied common sense. Meanwhile, the carnage of World War I, with its unprecedented mechanized slaughter, had shattered faith in human progress and rational civilization. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and upheaval, a new philosophical movement emerged primarily in Germany and France that would take philosophy in radically different directions from the analytical tradition developing in Britain and America. Continental philosophy, as it came to be known, would focus not on logical analysis and scientific method, but on the lived experience of human beings struggling to find meaning in an apparently meaningless world. These philosophers would ask fundamentally different questions about consciousness, existence, freedom, and society, creating intellectual frameworks that continue to influence not just philosophy, but literature, psychology, politics, and the arts. Phenomenology. Back to the things themselves. The story begins with Edmund Husserl, a quiet revolutionary who was born in 1859 in what is now the Czech Republic, to a Jewish family that had converted to Protestantism. Husserl initially studied mathematics at the University of Leipzig, where he worked under the renowned mathematician Karl Weierstrass, one of the founders of modern mathematical analysis. His early academic career seemed destined for pure mathematics, but Husserl became increasingly troubled by philosophical questions about the foundations of mathematical knowledge that his purely mathematical training could not answer. The crisis that led Husserl to philosophy emerged from his growing awareness that even mathematics, the most certain of all sciences, rested on foundations that were far from clear. How do we know that mathematical truths correspond to reality? What is the nature of mathematical objects like numbers and geometric figures? Are they discovered or invented? These questions led Husserl to a deeper philosophical investigation that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and knowledge. Husserl's breakthrough came with his recognition that philosophy had become lost in abstract metaphysical speculation, endlessly debating questions about the ultimate nature of reality without carefully examining the phenomena that give rise to these questions in the first place. His rallying cry became, "Back to the things themselves." But this did not mean a return to naive realism or simple empiricism. Instead, Husserl proposed that philosophy should begin with a careful, systematic description of how things appear to consciousness before making any assumptions about their ultimate metaphysical status. This approach, which Husserl called phenomenology, was based on a fundamental insight about the nature of consciousness that would transform 20th century philosophy. Husserl discovered that consciousness is always intentional, a technical term that did not mean consciousness is always deliberate or purposeful, but rather that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Every mental act is directed toward an object. When we perceive something. When we remember something. When we imagine something. Even emotional states like anxiety or joy are intentional in this sense, as we are anxious about something or joyful about something. This insight had revolutionary implications because it meant that consciousness and world are not separate entities that somehow need to be connected, as traditional philosophy had assumed. Instead, consciousness and world are always already correlated in an inseparable relationship. The traditional philosophical problem of how the mind makes contact with an external world was based on the false assumption that mind and world could be meaningfully separated in the first place. To study this consciousness-world correlation systematically, Husserl developed a method he called the epoch or phenomenological reduction. This was a methodological procedure rather than a form of skeptical doubt like that employed by Descartes. Instead of doubting the existence of the external world, Husserl proposed to bracket or suspend judgment about the independent existence of objects and focus purely on how these objects appear to consciousness. He called this suspending the natural attitude, our everyday assumption that the world exists independently of our consciousness of it. When we perform the phenomenological reduction, we do not deny that the world exists, but we put aside this assumption in order to examine the structures of experience itself. For example, when studying the experience of perceiving a house, the phenomenologist does not ask whether the house really exists as a physical object. Instead, they carefully describe how the house appears to consciousness, how it presents itself prospectively, always showing only some of its sides while others remain hidden, how its appearance changes as we move around it, how it stands out against its background, how it carries various meanings related to shelter, home, architecture, and so forth. Husserl spent decades developing increasingly sophisticated analyses of different types of conscious acts. He examined the temporal structure of consciousness, showing how every present moment of awareness contains retentions of the just past and pretensions toward the about to come. He analyzed the constitution of physical objects, demonstrating how our sense of solid, enduring things emerges from the synthesis of multiple perspectives over time. He investigated intersubjectivity, the problem of how we recognize and understand other minds. His work was incredibly detailed and technical, often requiring readers to perform the phenomenological analyses for themselves rather than simply accepting his descriptions. Husserl's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle of students. His emphasis on careful description of experience influenced psychology, sociology, and even mathematics. His insights about intentionality became central to debates in philosophy of mind that continue today. But perhaps his most significant influence came through his most famous student, Martin Heidegger, who would take phenomenology in directions that Husserl himself found deeply troubling. Martin Heidegger was born in 1889 in Meßkirch, a small village in the Black Forest region of southwestern Germany. His father was a sexton and cooper, and young Martin initially seemed destined for the priesthood. He studied theology and philosophy at the University of Freiburg, where he first encountered Husserl's work. The meeting between these two men would prove to be one of the most consequential in the history of philosophy, though it would eventually end in bitter disagreement and mutual recrimination. Heidegger began as Husserl's devoted student and assistant, but he gradually came to believe that even Husserl's revolutionary phenomenological approach did not penetrate deeply enough into the fundamental questions of philosophy. While Husserl focused on the structures of consciousness and its intentional acts, Heidegger became obsessed with a more basic question. What does it mean for anything to be at all? This question of being had been at the heart of philosophy since the ancient Greeks, but Heidegger argued that Western philosophy had consistently overlooked or forgotten it. Instead of asking about the being of beings, philosophers had focused on particular beings and their properties, missing the more fundamental question of what it means for anything to exist in the first place. This forgetting of being was not simply an intellectual oversight, but represented a deep crisis in Western civilization itself. Heidegger's masterwork, Being and Time, published in 1927 when he was still in his 30s, began with this question of being, but approached it in a novel way. Heidegger realized that to understand being in general, he needed to start with the one being for whom being is a question, human existence. Humans are unique among all beings because we exist as a question to ourselves. We wonder about our own existence, worry about our future, live in awareness of our mortality. This distinctive way of being Heidegger called Dasein, literally meaning being there. Dasein is not simply consciousness, as Husserl had conceived it, but rather a way of being in the world. We do not first exist as isolated subjects who then somehow make contact with an external world. Instead, we are always already thrown into a world of meanings, relationships and possibilities that we did not choose. We find ourselves in particular historical situations, cultures and languages that shape who we are from the very beginning. This thrownness is one of the fundamental structures of Dasein. We are thrown into existence without choosing to be born, into circumstances we did not select, inheriting a world that is already meaningful in ways determined by those who came before us. Yet despite this thrownness, we are also essentially characterized by projection toward future possibilities. We exist as potential, constantly facing choices about who we will become. This tension between thrownness and projection creates what Heidegger called the throne projection that defines human existence. Most of the time, however, we flee from the anxiety and responsibility that comes with this existence as throne projection. We lose ourselves in what Heidegger called the they-self, or Das Man, the anonymous public realm of conventional opinions, social roles and everyday concerns. We adopt the values and behaviors of others without questioning them, go along with social expectations, and busy ourselves with mundane tasks that distract us from the fundamental questions of our existence. This falling into the they-self represents what Heidegger called inauthentic existence. It is not necessarily immoral or wrong, but it involves a kind of self-forgetfulness in which we lose touch with our own most possibilities and responsibilities. We become what others expect us to be, rather than taking ownership of our own existence. Authentic existence, by contrast, involves what Heidegger called resoluteness, owning up to our thrownness while taking responsibility for our projection toward future possibilities. This does not mean rejecting all social conventions or becoming antisocial, but rather choosing our commitments and projects with full awareness of our freedom and responsibility, rather than simply following the crowd. The path to authentic existence typically involves moments of anxiety or angst, which Heidegger distinguished sharply from fear. Fear is always fear of something specific, some particular threat or danger in the world. Anxiety, however, has no specific object. It is anxiety in the face of existence itself, a confrontation with the groundlessness and uncertainty of human life. In moments of deep anxiety, the familiar world of everyday concerns loses its obvious meaning and importance. We experience what Heidegger called the uncanniness of existence, a sense that our ordinary, comfortable world is actually strange and unfamiliar. This experience of anxiety is deeply unsettling, but Heidegger argued that it also opens up the possibility of authentic existence. Anxiety individualizes us, calling us back from our absorption in the anonymous they-self to confront our own existence as a question. It reveals that much of what we take for granted is actually contingent and chosen, opening up space for different choices and different ways of being. The ultimate experience of individualization comes through what Heidegger called being toward death. Death is the possibility that is most uniquely mine, the one experience that I cannot share with others or delegate to someone else. While I can have various experiences in common with others, my death is irreducibly my own. When I truly confront my own mortality, not as an abstract fact but as my own most possibility, I achieve what Heidegger called authentic temporality. Most of the time we think about death in inauthentic ways, treating it as something that happens to people in general rather than something that will happen to me specifically. We say things like everyone dies eventually, or death is a natural part of life, treating mortality as a general fact rather than my own most certain possibility. But authentic being toward death involves recognizing that my existence is finite and therefore irreplaceably precious. This awareness of mortality can motivate authentic living, as I realize that I have limited time to make my existence meaningful and cannot indefinitely postpone the fundamental choices about who I will be. Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence culminated in his concept of the moment of vision, a temporally integrated experience in which past, present and future come together in a moment of decisive action. In such moments I own up to my thrownness, acknowledging the inheritance and situation I have received from the past, while projecting resolutely toward future possibilities that I choose as my own. This is not a mystical or otherworldly experience, but rather the structure of any genuinely decisive human action. Being and time was only the first part of Heidegger's projected investigation into the question of being, but the second part was never completed in the form originally planned. Heidegger's thinking underwent what he called a turn in the 1930s, moving away from the analysis of Dasein toward a more direct meditation on being itself. This later thinking became increasingly poetic and mystical, focusing on language, art and technology as ways in which being reveals and conceals itself. Unfortunately, Heidegger's philosophical revolution was accompanied by a personal and political failure that cast a dark shadow over his entire corpus. In 1933, shortly after the Nazi rise to power, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party and accepted appointment as rector of the University of Freiburg. Though his active involvement with the party lasted only about a year, he never fully repudiated his support for National Socialism and made few efforts to help Jewish colleagues who were dismissed from the university. His relationship with his former mentor Husserl, who was Jewish, became strained and eventually hostile. The question of the relationship between Heidegger's philosophy and his politics remains deeply controversial. Some argue that his emphasis on authenticity, resoluteness and decisive action provided philosophical cover for authoritarianism and violence. Others contend that his political involvement was a personal failing that does not invalidate the insights of his philosophical work. What is clear is that Heidegger's case raises important questions about the relationship between philosophical ideas and moral responsibility that continue to be debated today. Despite these troubling aspects of his biography, Heidegger's influence on subsequent philosophy has been enormous. His fundamental questioning of the tradition of Western metaphysics opened up new ways of thinking about language, art, technology, and the human condition. His insights about anxiety, authenticity, and mortality deeply influenced the existentialist movement that emerged in France during and after World War II. Existentialism, existence precedes essence. The philosophy that emerged from Heidegger's fundamental ontology became known as existentialism, though many of its key figures rejected this label as oversimplified. Existentialism was not a systematic school of thought with an agreed-upon doctrine, but rather a shared emphasis on the primacy of human existence, the reality of human freedom, and the responsibility that comes with that freedom. The existentialists were deeply concerned with questions of meaning, authenticity, and how to live in a world that seemed to offer no objective foundation for values or purpose. The intellectual and cultural context of existentialism was shaped by the catastrophic events of the early 20th century. The mechanized slaughter of World War I had shattered faith in human progress and rational civilization. The rise of totalitarian movements showed how easily people could be manipulated and controlled. The Holocaust revealed depths of human evil that seemed to challenge basic assumptions about human nature and moral progress. In this context, traditional sources of meaning and value, whether religious, philosophical or political, seemed inadequate to the realities of modern existence. Jean-Paul Sartre emerged as the most famous and influential existentialist philosopher, though his path to philosophy was far from straightforward. Born in Paris in 1905 to a middle-class family, Sartre lost his father when he was very young and was raised primarily by his mother and grandfather. He was a brilliant but unconventional student who excelled in literature and philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure, the elite institution that trained French intellectuals. At the École Normale, Sartre met Simone de Beauvoir, who would become his lifelong companion and intellectual equal. Their relationship was unconventional by the standards of their time, as they rejected marriage and maintained what they called an essential relationship while allowing each other considerable freedom for other romantic involvements. This arrangement reflected their shared commitment to individual freedom and their rejection of conventional social expectations about how people should live. Sartre's philosophical development was significantly influenced by his experience of World War II. He was drafted into the French army, captured by the Germans in 1940, and spent 9 months in a prisoner of war camp. This experience of captivity and powerlessness, followed by his participation in the French resistance after his release, deeply shaped his thinking about human freedom and responsibility. Even in the most constrained circumstances, Sartre realized human beings retain the freedom to choose their attitude toward their situation. Sartre's central philosophical insight was captured in his famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence." This phrase was a direct challenge to the entire tradition of Western philosophy, which had generally assumed that things have fixed natures or essences that determine what they are and how they should behave. A knife, for example, is designed for cutting, and we can evaluate how good a knife it is based on how well it fulfills this essential function. But human beings, Sartre argued, are fundamentally different. We exist first, and only then do we create our essence through our choices and actions. There is no human nature that determines how we should live, no blueprint or design that tells us our purpose. We are thrown into existence without our consent, but once we exist, we are free to determine what we will make of ourselves. This radical freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. It meant that we cannot blame our actions on our circumstances, our upbringing, our psychological makeup, or our social roles. Even in the most oppressive situations, we retain the freedom to choose our response. Sartre illustrated this with examples from his own experience in the prisoner of war camp, where even under conditions of extreme constraint, prisoners could choose whether to collaborate with their captors, resist them, or simply endure their situation with dignity. But freedom of this magnitude comes with a price: anguish. When we truly recognize the extent of our freedom, we experience a kind of vertigo at the realization that we are completely responsible for creating ourselves. This anguish reveals itself in moments when we confront significant choices and realize that there is no objective standard or authority that can tell us what we should do. We are condemned to be free, as Sartre put it, meaning that we have no choice but to choose, and we bear full responsibility for the consequences of our choices. This confrontation with radical freedom leads many people to what Sartre called bad faith, a form of self-deception in which we deny our freedom and pretend that we are determined by forces beyond our control. Bad faith involves treating ourselves as things rather than as free beings, adopting the perspective of others about ourselves rather than taking responsibility for our own self-creation. Sartre's most famous example of bad faith was his analysis of a waiter in a cafe. Sartre observed how the waiter seemed to be playing at being a waiter, moving with exaggerated precision and adopting the gestures and mannerisms that he believed defined his role. The waiter appeared to identify completely with his social function, acting as if being a waiter were his essential nature, rather than a role he had chosen to play. This performance revealed the waiter's bad faith. By identifying completely with his social role, the waiter avoided confronting the anxiety of his freedom. He acted as if his behavior were determined by the objective requirements of being a waiter, rather than acknowledging that he was choosing moment by moment how to perform this role. He treated himself as a thing with a fixed nature, rather than as a free being who must constantly create himself through his choices. Bad faith can take many different forms. We might deny our freedom by claiming that we are simply products of our psychological makeup, arguing that we cannot help being the way we are because of our childhood experiences or genetic inheritance. We might lose ourselves in romantic love, making another person responsible for our happiness and sense of meaning rather than taking responsibility for our own emotional life. We might adopt rigid moral or religious codes that tell us exactly how to behave, avoiding the difficult work of making our own ethical choices. Particularly insidious is what Sartre called the spirit of seriousness, the attitude that treats social values and institutions as if they were objective features of reality rather than human creations. When we take social roles, moral rules, or political ideologies with complete seriousness, we deny our freedom to question and recreate these structures. We act as if we had no choice but to conform to expectations that are actually contingent and changeable. Sartre's famous play No Exit explored another dimension of human existence that complicates our freedom, our relationships with other people. The play's famous line, "Hell is other people," is often misunderstood as a general statement about human nature, but Sartre meant something more specific. The presence of other people creates a fundamental problem for human consciousness, because when another person looks at me, they see me as an object, rather than recognizing my freedom and subjectivity. This look of the other can be profoundly alienating and objectifying. When I become aware that someone is looking at me, I suddenly see myself from their perspective, experiencing myself as an object in their world, rather than as the free subject of my own experience. This can create shame, as I realize that the other person may be judging me according to standards I do not accept, or it can create a desire to control how others see me, leading to various forms of performance and manipulation. Yet Sartre also recognized that we need recognition from others to achieve full selfhood. It is only through the acknowledgement of other free beings that we can fully realize our own freedom. This creates a complex dialectic in human relationships as we simultaneously need others to recognize our freedom while experiencing their recognition as a potential threat to that very freedom. The problem is particularly acute in what Sartre called being for others, the dimension of human existence that involves our awareness of how we appear to other people. We cannot simply ignore what others think of us because their perspectives become part of our own self-understanding. Yet if we become too concerned with others' opinions, we risk losing touch with our own authentic projects and values. Sartre's analysis of interpersonal relations revealed the complexity of human freedom. While we are individually free to create ourselves, we exist in a social world where our freedom inevitably encounters the freedom of others. This can lead to conflict as each person tries to maintain their own freedom while dealing with the freedom of others. But it can also lead to more authentic forms of relationship based on mutual recognition of each other's freedom and subjectivity. Simone de Beauvoir, though often overshadowed by her more famous partner, was an equally important philosopher who made crucial contributions to existentialist thought and pioneered what would later become feminist existentialism. Born in 1908 into a bourgeois Parisian family, de Beauvoir was an exceptional student who excelled in philosophy and literature. She was the second woman ever to receive the aggregation in philosophy, the competitive examination that allowed her to teach in French secondary schools, and she finished second in the exam while Sartre finished first. De Beauvoir's philosophical development paralleled Sartre's in many ways, but she brought her own distinctive insights to existentialist themes. Her most famous work, The Second Sex, published in 1949, applied existentialist insights to the situation of women and became one of the foundational texts of modern feminism. De Beauvoir began The Second Sex with the observation that throughout history, women have been defined as the other in relation to men, who have positioned themselves as the universal human subject. While men have been seen as representing humanity in general, women have been defined by their difference from this supposed norm. This othering of women has had profound consequences for how women understand themselves and their possibilities. The famous declaration that opens the second volume of The Second Sex, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and identity. De Beauvoir argued that femininity is not a natural or essential characteristic of female human beings, but rather a social construction, a set of behaviours, attitudes and characteristics that women are taught to adopt through their upbringing and social experience. This insight was revolutionary because it suggested that gender differences are not inevitable consequences of biological sex, but rather contingent social arrangements that could potentially be changed. If femininity is learned rather than innate, then it is possible for women to choose different ways of being and relating to the world. But de Beauvoir went beyond simply critiquing women's social situation. She showed how women's position as the other had led many to adopt forms of bad faith similar to those Sartre had analysed in general terms. Because women had been excluded from many forms of public life and discouraged from developing their own projects and ambitions, many had found identity and meaning primarily through their relationships to men as wives, mothers and lovers. This situation created what de Beauvoir called the eternal feminine, a set of supposedly essential feminine characteristics that were actually products of women's social situation. Women were described as naturally nurturing, emotional, intuitive and self-sacrificing. But de Beauvoir argued that these characteristics developed because women had been denied opportunities to exercise their freedom in other ways. The result was that many women had become complicit in their own oppression, accepting their subordinate status and finding meaning through service to others rather than through their own autonomous projects. This was a form of bad faith because it involved denying their own freedom and potential in favour of identities defined by others. True liberation for women would require more than legal or political equality, though these were certainly necessary. It would require women to claim their freedom and take responsibility for creating their own existence, just as Sartre had argued all human beings must do. This meant developing their own projects and ambitions, refusing to define themselves solely through their relationships to others, and taking responsibility for their own happiness and fulfillment. But de Beauvoir also recognized that individual liberation was not sufficient. Women's situation was structured by social institutions and cultural assumptions that made it extremely difficult for individual women to achieve authentic existence. Real change would require collective action to transform these structures and create conditions in which women could more easily exercise their freedom. Albert Camus, though he rejected the existentialist label, and often disagreed with Sartre on political questions, was closely associated with the movement and shared many of its concerns. Born in Algeria in 1913 to a poor family, Camus grew up in a world marked by poverty, colonialism and cultural conflict. His father died in World War I when Camus was very young, and he was raised by his mother and grandmother in a working-class neighbourhood of Algiers. Camus studied philosophy at the University of Algiers, where he wrote a thesis on the relationship between Christianity and ancient Greek thought. But his academic career was cut short by tuberculosis, a disease that would plague him throughout his relatively short life and constantly remind him of his mortality. Camus' central philosophical concern was what he called the absurd, a condition that arises from the confrontation between human needs and the apparent meaninglessness of the universe. Human beings have a deep need for meaning, understanding, and justice, but the world seems indifferent to these needs. We cry out for answers, but the universe remains silent. We seek justice, but the world appears fundamentally unjust. We desire immortality and permanence, but we are condemned to die in a cosmos that seems eternal and indifferent. This confrontation between human aspirations and cosmic indifference creates what Camus called the feeling of the absurd. It is not a philosophical theory, but rather a lived experience that most people have at some point in their lives, moments when the ordinary world suddenly appears strange and meaningless, when our usual activities and concerns seem pointless and arbitrary. Many people respond to this experience by turning to religion, philosophy, or political ideology to provide the meaning and purpose that the universe seems to lack. But Camus saw these responses as forms of what he called philosophical suicide, attempts to escape from the human condition rather than honestly confronting it. Religious faith promises ultimate meaning and justice in another world, but Camus argued that this requires abandoning reason and accepting beliefs that cannot be justified. Philosophical systems claim to discover objective meaning in history or human nature, but Camus found these claims unconvincing. Political ideologies promise to create perfect societies that will eliminate absurdity and suffering, but Camus saw these promises as dangerous illusions that justify present oppression in the name of future perfection. Instead of escaping from absurdity, Camus argued that we should embrace it. We should live fully and passionately while acknowledging that our existence has no ultimate meaning or justification. This attitude of revolt involves a refusal to accept either the meaninglessness of existence or false promises of ultimate meaning. Camus found his model for this response in the ancient myth of Sisyphus, the king who was condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time he reached the summit. Sisyphus's punishment seems to represent the ultimate in meaningless suffering, an endless repetition of futile effort. But Camus argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. In the moment when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain to retrieve his boulder, he is superior to his fate. He has chosen to continue his task not because it has ultimate meaning, but precisely because he recognizes its meaninglessness. His revolt against the absurd lies not in escape or denial, but in acknowledgement and defiance. This philosophy of revolt did not lead Camus to nihilism or despair. Instead, it motivated him to engage passionately with the world, to fight against injustice and oppression, even while recognizing that ultimate victory is impossible. His novel The Plague used the metaphor of a plague-stricken city to explore how people can maintain their humanity and solidarity in the face of absurd suffering. The plague in the novel represents any form of suffering or evil that strikes human beings without reason or justice. The characters who emerge as heroic are not those who find ultimate meaning in their suffering, but those who continue to fight against it simply because fighting is the human thing to do. Dr. Rieux, the novel's protagonist, works tirelessly to treat plague victims not because he believes he can ultimately defeat the plague, but because healing the sick is what doctors do. This ethic of revolt, without hope of ultimate victory, became central to Camus' political philosophy. He opposed both fascism and communism because both ideologies justified present suffering in the name of future perfection. Against revolutionary violence that claimed to serve higher purposes, Camus advocated what he called moderation. a commitment to reducing suffering and injustice, without claiming to have discovered the final solution to human problems. The existentialist emphasis on individual freedom and responsibility was both inspiring and troubling. It offered a vision of human dignity and authenticity that appealed to many people living through the crises of the 20th century. But it also seemed to ignore the social and economic structures that limit individual choice and shape human possibilities. This critique would be taken up by another major strand of continental philosophy that emerged during the same period: critical theory. Critical theory, philosophy as social criticism. While the existentialists were exploring individual freedom and authenticity, another group of German philosophers was developing a very different approach to understanding human existence and its problems. These thinkers, associated with what became known as the Frankfurt School, argued that philosophy needed to become more explicitly political and critical of existing social arrangements. They believed that individual freedom was meaningless unless it was accompanied by fundamental social transformation. The Frankfurt School emerged from the Institute for Social Research, founded in Frankfurt am Main in 1923, with funding from a wealthy German grain merchant named Felix Weil. The institute was conceived as an independent research centre that would bring together scholars from different disciplines to study society from a critical perspective. Many of the key figures associated with the institute were Jewish intellectuals who were forced to flee Germany after the Nazi rise to power, eventually settling in the United States before returning to Germany after the war. The intellectual context for critical theory was provided by the apparent failure of Marxist predictions about the inevitable collapse of capitalism and the rise of socialist revolution. By the 1920s, it was clear that the working class in advanced capitalist countries was not becoming increasingly revolutionary. Instead, workers seemed to be accepting capitalism and even supporting fascist movements that promised to defend their interests against international threats. This situation posed a fundamental challenge to traditional Marxist theory, which had assumed that economic contradictions would inevitably lead to political revolution. The Frankfurt School theorists set out to understand why this revolutionary transformation had not occurred, and what new forms of domination were preventing people from recognizing their true interests. Max Horkheimer became the Institute's director in 1930 and articulated the basic program of what he called critical theory. Born in 1895 to a wealthy Jewish family involved in the textile business, Horkheimer had initially been expected to take over the family firm, but was drawn to philosophy and social theory. He studied with some of the leading German philosophers of his time, including Edmund Husserl, and developed a sophisticated understanding of both the German philosophical tradition and contemporary social science. Horkheimer's programmatic essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, published in 1937, distinguished between two fundamentally different approaches to understanding society. Traditional theory, exemplified by the natural sciences and conventional social science, aimed to be objective and value-neutral, describing the world as it is without making judgments about how it should be. This approach assumed that knowledge could be separated from practical interests and that the goal of theory was simply to discover universal laws governing natural and social phenomena. Critical theory, by contrast, was explicitly committed to human emancipation. It sought to understand the social forces that prevented people from realizing their full potential and to point toward possibilities for liberation. Critical theorists argued that the appearance of objectivity in traditional theory was itself ideological, serving to legitimize existing power relations by making them appear natural and inevitable. This approach was deeply influenced by Karl Marx's critique of political economy. But the Frankfurt School theorists went beyond Marx in several important ways. While Marx had focused primarily on economic exploitation and class conflict, the critical theorists were particularly interested in understanding how culture, psychology, and ideology functioned to maintain systems of domination. They asked why people often seemed to accept or even embrace conditions that were clearly not in their rational interest. Theodor Adorno, who became Horkheimer's closest collaborator, brought a unique perspective to these questions. Born in 1903 to a Jewish father and Catholic mother, Adorno was trained in both philosophy and music composition. He studied with some of the leading avant-garde composers of his time, including Alban Berg, and this musical background deeply influenced his approach to social and cultural criticism. Adorno was particularly concerned with understanding how what he and Horkheimer called the culture industry served to manipulate and control people's consciousness. Unlike traditional Marxists, who had often dismissed culture as mere superstructure built on an economic base, Adorno argued that cultural production had become a crucial mechanism of social control in advanced capitalist societies. The culture industry, as Adorno analyzed it, involved the mass production of cultural goods according to the same principles that governed industrial production generally. Movies, popular music, radio programs, and other cultural products were manufactured according to standardized formulas designed to maximize profits and minimize the risk of commercial failure. The result was a pseudo-individualization in which cultural products appeared to offer variety and choice, while actually conforming to rigid patterns that discouraged genuine creativity or critical thinking. This analysis reached its peak in the collaboration between Horkheimer and Adorno on their joint work Dialectic of Enlightenment, written during their exile in the United States and published in 1947. This book offered a sweeping critique of modern Western civilization, arguing that the very rationality that was supposed to liberate humanity had instead become a new and more subtle form of domination. The Enlightenment had promised that reason would free humanity from superstition, ignorance, and oppression. Scientific knowledge would give human beings control over nature, while rational institutions would create just and efficient forms of social organization. But Horkheimer and Adorno argued that this Enlightenment project had led to its opposite, a society that was technically advanced, but spiritually impoverished, capable of great productivity, but also of unprecedented destruction. The problem, they argued, lay in the predominance of what they called instrumental reason, a form of rationality focused exclusively on efficiency and control. Instrumental reason reduces everything, including human beings, to mere objects to be manipulated and controlled for the achievement of predetermined goals. It asks not whether these goals are worthy or meaningful, but only how they can be achieved most efficiently. This instrumental rationality had colonized not only technology and economics, but also politics, culture, and even personal relationships. People were increasingly treated as human resources to be managed rather than as ends in themselves worthy of respect and consideration.